Though the macroeconomic indicators prove that the economy under President Biden is objectively strong and the envy of the rest of the world, the Republican Party, the Fox propaganda network, and unfortunately other major elements of the mainstream media seem to be working overtime to try to downplay Biden's successes as the 2024 election rapidly approaches. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, we have a couple of clips to look at in this video. Part of it's kind of like one of my favorite traditions here at Pondering Politics, which is play a couple of clips of Fox News, acknowledging the objective reality of the strength of President Biden's economy, though, of course, doing their part not to give him any credit, and then the cope which comes afterwards, particularly from the commentary shows like Maria Bartiromo. So we'll play this clip of Stuart Varney talking about the strength of President Biden's economy from a recent episode.
Look at the futures, first of all. We're up 477 points on the Dow, 56 points for the S&P, and the NASDAQ roaring ahead by 270 points. That's 1.5% for the NASDAQ. Big gain right there.
So this is obviously referring to the stock market. As far as I'm concerned, it's by far not the most important macroeconomic indicator, but it is to Republicans and conservatives. That's the only, to Donald Trump, it's the most important macroeconomic indicator, which counts, of course, being a real estate New York billionaire. But even by that metric, the stock market has performed exceptionally well under President Biden. But if you also look at unemployment as well, we are at a 27-month spree. 27 months where unemployment rate is under 4%. It's like an historic achievement.
I'm seeing this statistic that unemployment rate has now been below 4% for 27 straight months. The last time that happened, Richard Nixon was in office. So that seems to me the good news story the Biden camp will want to tell.
So it's true, right? So unemployment ticked up to 3.9% from where it was the month before, but it's still under 4%, an historic achievement. The April jobs report came in because we're now in May, and the United States economy added about 175,000 jobs, okay, which was under what was expected. But economists did expect that the labor market would eventually start to slow down with respect to job creation. As a matter of fact, Biden has constantly beat the odds month after month after month after month after month. So this is the first time in a long time where they actually expected higher and the number of jobs created was a bit lower. Now, the reason I bring that up is because other elements of the right, the Republican Party and parts of the Fox propaganda network, and even the New York Times are trying to spin this as something negative, as something bad. Oh, this is apocalyptic. And before I show you the parts about the labor market, I do want to play this clip from Maria Bartiromo's show in our Fox News panel. So the Federal Reserve, they're the government body, which is they're supposed to be independent. They technically report to the president. The president is the one who appoints the governors on the board of directors for the Federal Reserve. But they don't work for him. Like, they don't take commands from the president of the United States. They're an independent executive branch agency. And they control interest rates. And so Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, said towards the end of last year that he intended to cut interest rates 2 to 3 to 4 times throughout 2024, lowering interest rates, which that would help relieve quite a bit of economic burden from most Americans, which would be really good for President Biden in an election year. The Fox propaganda network is freaking out about the prospect of Jerome Powell cutting interest rates in a way that they know would help Biden because he's the incumbent president. It would help perceptions even more that the economy is strong. They're terrified that he'll do this, and they're demanding that he not, even though Donald Trump, during COVID in 2020, demanded that Jerome not raise interest rates. So it's okay for Trump to demand that the Federal Reserve, when he's president, do things that are politically advantageous to him. But it's not okay for the Federal Reserve to just independently do things that may be politically advantageous to Biden. You see that double standard? Well, you'll see it here.
He went out on the limb in December. We're going to do 3 rate cuts. He cannot, after the transitory thing, it's his legacy. It's his legacy. Yeah. He wants it so badly. And again, some would say excuse to cut rates, they're going to take it. And by the way, he said, forget the politics. If they've got to do it in September and they get the okay, they'll do it in September.
No, they're going to get criticized for that being political right before the election. But
Again, so anything the Federal Reserve does to help Americans, again, to give them some breathing room, as President Biden would say, to lower interest rates, right, provide some sort of economic relief, it would be seen as politically advantageous to Biden. And so now Fox is freaking out about the prospect. No, for the love of God, don't do it. Again, the double standard is crippling. So again, we'll get into the Republicans trying to downplay this jobs report and the unemployment rate and actually say that it's a sign that, Donald Trump has a better economic record and President Biden's economic record is just apocalyptic in comparison. Aaron Rupar had this funny post. I love this. And so he flipped the jobs created by president, and it shows how President Biden's job creation numbers are higher than Trump's and any other Republican president. Actually, if you can see here, Reagan's the only Republican president who created a bunch of jobs. You have George H.W. Bush. President Clinton created more than Reagan. W. Bush didn't create that many jobs. President Obama got us out of the Great Recession. Trump was the only president in modern history since Herbert Hoover to leave office with a net deficit of jobs. And then nearly 16 million jobs have been created under President Biden. Aaron Rupar says, listen, if you flip that graph, Trump's jobs record looks good, right? Because he's the only one, if you flip it, to be on top. Okay, so now let's get into the reaction from the New York Times. Okay, this is the big one as far as I'm concerned. Actually, no, let me do this. Let's go first to the Republican response. So House Republicans tweeted this picture of President Biden. That's bidenomics. And they link this article. U.S. job growth slowed considerably last month with just 170,000 positions added in April. Again, the first time in a long time that the jobs report underperformed. But as I pointed out here, it's hilarious that the GOP is trying to use this as proof that Biden's economy is terrible. The numbers from the very article they cite don't lie. So I point this out. In that very article that the GOP cited, markets surged under President Biden in April. Although April jobs numbers are sharply cooler than the upwardly revised 315,000 gains notched in March, they're in line with what was seen pre-pandemic and the neutral rate of job growth to keep pace with population gains. So this is not an underperformance, right? It didn't exceed expectations. It didn't match the absurdly high expectations that we have come to have of President Biden's job record, which is vastly superior to Donald Trump's. But just based on everything else, it's actually in line with pre-pandemic levels. And that's what Trump supporters demand all the time that we consider. Oh, don't talk about the recovery. You got to talk about the pre-pandemic trajectory. Well, even this relatively underperforming jobs record for Biden is still on track with what Trump had pre-pandemic by the very article that they cited. This is a quote, from a bigger picture standpoint, you see a labor market that's still pretty strong, pretty tight. Michael Pugliese, a senior economist with Wells Fargo, so Republicans should trust Wells Fargo, of all people, told CNN in an interview Friday, quote, this is a far, far cry from 2020, when Donald Trump was president, or 2009, when Barack Obama inherited George W. Bush's Great Recession, or the outright weak labor markets we've seen over the past 15 or so years. But it is clear at this point that it's not as tight of a labor market as what we had at the peak there in late 2021 or much of 2022. Because again, they expected this. They expected a cool down in the labor market much sooner, which is part of the reason why Jerome Powell raised interest rates and haven't lowered them. Because the hot labor market, the hot jobs market, has continued well after economists expected it would cool off. This, again, from the same article the Republican cite. The unemployment rate ticked higher to 3.9%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But April marks the 27th consecutive month that the jobless rate has held under 4%, matching a streak last seen in the late 1960s. So unemployment, which is one of the most important macroeconomic metrics, is still better under Biden. It was the lowest it's ever been under Biden compared to Trump. So at its best, it was better than Trump's. And in terms of just the overall rate, Trump has never matched this. Now let's get to the media part, because I said it wasn't just Fox News. It wasn't just the Republican Party. You also have elements of the mainstream media. So Keith Edwards pointed this out on Twitter. Same news, two different stories. We're going to start with the first one. The Guardian. U.S. adds 175,000 jobs in April in 40th straight month of gains as unemployment stays below 4%, in longest such streak since 1953. Right below it, another push notification, but this time from the New York Times. The U.S. employers added 175,000 jobs in April, a downshift in the pace of hiring. The unemployment rate ticked up to 3.9%. From the New York Times, and I love bringing that up because everyone says, oh, the New York Times, it's in the bed for liberals and progressives and the Democrats. It's just not true. The New York Times is as eager to throw Biden under the bus as most are now. Is it as ideologically driven towards the right as Fox News is? No. But they will gladly sensationalize and catastrophize and everything else because that's what generates clicks. We are in a negativity media environment, and the Democrats are just in a hostile media ecosystem, period. But we also found out recently, according to people who work at the New York Times, that one of its most prominent figures, I believe it's their editor-in-chief, is actually furious that President Biden hasn't given them an interview. And so according to Blockbuster reporting from Politico, he has encouraged and incentivized his reporters to write negative stories about the Biden administration in retaliation. New York Times reporters say that their nonstop coverage of Biden's age is retribution for not giving their boss an interview. Quote, it's AG. This is the guy in question. He's the one who's pissed that Biden hasn't done any interviews and quietly encourages all the tough reporting on his age. Okay. We've talked about this. Even the so-called liberal mainstream media grades Republicans on a curve and tends to be pretty harsh with Democrats in comparison. I've given you examples, not just from the Biden administration or the Biden era, but also in the Trump administration. We've seen articles from AP and Reuters and others where if Donald Trump achieved a certain unemployment level, it was celebrated. If Biden achieves as good or better, it's downplayed if it's talked about really at all at length. So you have the Republican Party trying to spin a pretty good report, which again, even by Biden's high standards, because Biden has vastly exceeded expectations. His jobs record is just objectively better than Trump's, even if you control for COVID, which, as I've told you before, we're not obligated to do because Trump's terrible COVID mismanagement got us into the job situation that we found ourselves during the pandemic. He is responsible in part for the collapse of the economy due to his poor management of the pandemic. And Biden gets the credit for the recovery because he presided over the recovery. He did things that materially impacted the recovery. He oversaw the federal response to vaccinations. He about doubled the rate of vaccinations when he took over, which allowed the economy to open back up safely. He passed the American Rescue Plan, which avoided a double-digit recession, created 4 million jobs a year or two ahead of schedule. All the CHIPS Act and Science Act, which is considered, brought back 800,000 manufacturing jobs. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which is creating, construction projects and labor all across this country. He gets the credit for that. We can point to that. But even if we control for that, we reached pre-pandemic levels of employment back in August 2022. And the monthly average since then for Biden is still better than it was for Trump pre-COVID. No matter how you slice it, the objective conclusion ends at the same place. Biden's job record is better. And Republicans know it. And so they're hoping that they can downplay it. Because actually, if you look at polls, most Americans say that they believe that jobs have been lost under Biden rather than gained, which is just objectively untrue. The American people are wrong. But it doesn't matter, right? Because at the end of the day, you vote based on how you feel or what you think is true, even if what you think is true is wrong. So Republicans, Fox Propaganda Network, and again, even the New York Times, even if they're not conspiring together, they are working aggressively towards the same end, exacerbating a very hostile media environment for President Biden at a time when we really don't need it. But the numbers are what the numbers are, and Biden's economy is objectively good. So the question becomes, can you and I, can President Biden, can the Democrats, can we make a persuasive case to the American people before the election? It's going to be tough, but I think it's possible. Let me know what you think in the comments.